Welcome and good day. My name is Eric Mitchell. I'm Executive Director for the Alliance to End Hunger, and I want to welcome all of you to the Roundtable on Climate Adaptation for Smallholder Agriculture in Policy and Practice. I want to also thank our colleagues and friends at IFAD for the continuing partnership with us and the commitment to raise critical issues such as those drawing the lines between climate, agriculture, hunger, and nutrition. I have a few housekeeping notes for today. Our roundtable discussion will involve breakout sessions in which we will have frank, small group discussions related to questions that will be posed to you later in the session. While the main meeting session will be recorded, the breakout sessions will not. Please feel free to use the chat box at any point if you have questions or need clarification on anything. I look forward to today's discussion as well as the important messaging we can get out of it for the policy discussions as we advocate for smallholder farmers who are disproportionately impacted by our changing climate. Now I'd like to turn things over to Joanna Veltri and IFAD to provide a few additional remarks.
Okay. Thanks so much, Eric, and good morning to everyone. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And thanks to Eric for his thoughtful introduction and to the Alliance to End Hunger for bringing us together on what we see as a very important topic. My name is Joanna Veltri. I'm the head of the Americas Liaison Office here in DC for the International Fund for Agricultural Development, which is headquartered in Rome. For the uninitiated, and I know many of you already are familiar with IFAD, but IFAD is a multilateral financial institution and a specialized agency of the United Nations. We provide loans to countries to strengthen the lives and livelihoods of people and communities in rural areas. And via our very intensive consultative processes on the ground within the communities where IFAD projects happen, we've been seeing the impacts of climate change for quite some time now, and crucially, for today's discussion, the key connection between climate change and the trajectory of rural development, food and nutrition security, and the livelihoods in these areas where 80% of the world's food insecure people live. So this is the context for why we reached out to all of you, compounding the, as President Biden calls it, the existential threat of climate change. We have the daunting challenge ahead of us of making explicit what many policymakers have not necessarily fully internalized, which is the connection between climate change and hunger and rural development. And therefore, we need an increased focus on and indeed increased financing for climate adaptation interventions. Simply put, adaptation measures build smallholder resilience, increasing their ability to deal with climate shocks in the immediate, medium, and long term so that small-scale producers can maintain and improve productivity and income over time, instead of slipping, at times, precipitously backwards. Today, we are seeking your best ideas and inputs as to how we can most successfully push this agenda forward to benefit rural agriculture-focused communities with whom we work. Before I hand over to Jo Puri, who we are so lucky to have at IFAD with her tremendous experience and deep expertise on all things climate related, let me just give you a short preview of coming attractions. After our discussion with Jo, we will split up into 3 breakup groups for about 25 to 30 minutes. And our objective is to use these breakout sessions and the questions posed to each group to refine how international organizations and others can best approach and work with the Biden administration and with the Hill on increasing the focus on and the financing proportion for adaptation interventions and policies, including by deciphering who and what are the crucial entry points. Group 1 will focus on the most effective way to bring traditional mitigation-focused donors more strongly into adaptation spaces. Group 2 will focus on deciphering which arguments are the most compelling for why adaptation work is essential for small-scale food producers and the overall food security trajectory going forward. Is it the humanitarian argument? Is it the link to conflict and national security? Is it economic linkages in food systems? Is it other? What works best in this particular context here for policymakers? Group 3 will focus on what organizations focused on small-scale food producers and on food security should aim for in the context of COP26, and how we can best promote and increase focus on adaptation in COP26. And finally, at the end of the breakout session, we're hoping to seek views on how we can promote a better balance in resource allocation to expand the relative emphasis on adaptation as compared to mitigation, which is currently at about 1 to 18. Should we set a target, and what should the target be? Should it be 1 to 15, 1 to 10? What's too ambitious? What should we be targeting, and really what blesses that target? So you have all of that to look forward to, but meanwhile, allow me to briefly introduce Joe Puri. Jyotsna Puri, or Joe, is the director of the Environment, Climate, Gender, Youth, Nutrition, and Social Inclusion Division at IFAD, which is thankfully abbreviated ECG, much less of a mouthful. Joe leads the team that is responsible for evidence-informed advice on program designs and implementation, and for ensuring that IFAD's programs build in social, environmental, and climate safeguards while ensuring that IFAD's investments generate benefits in these areas. Joe previously has worked at the Green Climate Fund, 3IE, UNEP, the World Bank, and UNDP. Over to you, Joe.
Thank you so much, Joanna. Thank you very much for having me here, and such a privilege to be amongst all of you. I'm really looking forward to a discussion. So without much further ado, because I've been told that it's a very, very tightly run session, I'm going to share a few slides really to hopefully inspire and to provoke a few discussion points amongst all of you in this area of climate adaptation. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm hoping you can see my screen, and there it is. Okay. So why invest in climate adaptation? And my pitch is because it's attractive, because then you can be additional, you can be urgent, and you can be an innovator. Yeah, so with that, okay. So you all know this, but just so that we can start from a space where we are all familiar, climate change has meant greater variability and uncertainty for all of us. But it has especially meant that for the rural poor of the world. It's a risk multiplier. Climate change and the variability and the uncertainty that it brings with it is a risk multiplier, especially for the poor. And it's really the space, like Joanna said as well, where IFAD, or the International Fund for Agricultural Development, really targets itself, as well as the action that it does on the ground. Investing in rural people. Actually, it's an area where very few climate investors have gone or are going. And it's really one of the concerns that we want to share with you, but also see as to what we can do to galvanize this space, right? And here I want to present a few points, 4 points actually. Investing in rural small-scale producers is first and foremost a global public good. So traditionally, mitigation or climate mitigation has been seen to be, this overarching, very attractive global public good, because you're mitigating for the world, and that's how you're meeting your overall climate commitments. But really helping rural small-scale producers is a very important way of reaching the same target of a global good. Why is that? First, just to set the scene, the poor themselves actually account for more than 50%. So 52% of the overall population of the world is accounted for by the poor, right? And within that, then it becomes very sensible for us to focus on the rural poor, because smallholder farmers, who are predominantly rural, first produce more than 1/3 of the overall food supply. So the food that comes to our table, 1/3 of that is really produced by small-scale producers. This means that if we invest in them, we are essentially targeting global food security. So that's number one. Second, small-scale producers also tend to be, and there is excellent evidence to show this, tend to be far more diversified compared to large-scale producers. Yeah? Large-scale producers tend to be monocrop. They tend to have single crop, large plantations, while small-scale producers diversify because they know that diversification leads to, just at their level, greater resilience. But it also leads to greater global resilience. Whether you're intercropping, that is growing more than one crop together, or you're multiple cropping, so you have different crops but growing at different parts of the year, or you are bringing in agroecology or nature-based systems, essentially what you're doing is you're bringing separate sectors that are traditionally siloed in the international space and really working with all of them at the same time. That makes this space far more resilient, but it also contributes to making the globe far more resilient. Related to that, and I already mentioned, nature-based solutions. Rural small-scale producers are far more likely to use agroecological or nature-based solutions in their practices than others. So when you invest in rural small-scale producers, you're essentially not just adding to global food security and making ourselves more resilient, but you're also promoting nature-based solutions. And last but not least, you are generating core benefits, whether it is through greater variety of forest plantations or solar power stations or even adapted seeds. You are essentially targeting not just adaptation, you're also bringing in greater number of mitigation approaches. You're making women far more empowered, and you're also reaching nutrition targets through nutrition-sensitive value chains. Overall, investing in climate adaptation is an excellent way to be additional. What do I mean by additional? I'll talk about that. The second part of this is to say that investing in climate adaptation also means globally fewer conflicts and a need for disaster relief, right? We know the evidence is excellent in this space as well. Enough to know that climate change variability and uncertainty leads to conflict and forced migration. Whether it's floods in Mozambique or it's the big glacier melt that India witnessed in February, or it's the big migrations that are occurring in Mali, these are all a consequence of climate change uncertainty and natural resource scarcity, right? Evidence shows that a one standard deviation, that is about a 63% increase in rainfall or temperature, leads to an 11% change in the likelihood of conflict. This is pretty big. To find something as big as this to determine the likelihood of conflict, which essentially means causally or and conversely, that if you are able to staunch the amount of displacement caused by climate change, you are likely to reduce the likelihood of conflict, right? It is far more effective to invest in adaptation, which by definition is ex ante, so before the event, than in disaster relief, which is ex post. So it's the same thing as we see in medicine. Prevention is better than cure. Second, adaptation and investing in adaptation is a chance for leadership. Why do I say that? Climate policy initiative that worked very closely for us last year essentially helped us to see as to what the landscape of climate finance is in 2017, 2018. So there are a few things here. First, in the 580 billion annual average climate flows that were witnessed, most of them were directed towards mitigation. So mitigation was 18 times that of adaptation. And Joanna spoke about this as well. 537 of the total $579 billion went to mitigation. But not just that, most of the private sector corporate flows that were coming in, or private sector flows that were coming in, were going to mitigation. And they continue to do so. Right? Very little, if you're looking at my mouse, very little of these flows actually go into adaptation, which is only $30, right? And not just that, in the overall climate flows, in this very same work, we also saw that less than 2%, actually the number is 1.7%, 1.7% went to small-scale producers of total climate finance. So if ever there was a need to invest in this space, it is now, and it is this. So overall, mitigation far outstrips adaptation finance. So far, mitigation has drawn and attracted private actors. So clearly we are seeing, with the examples of solar, wind, a lot of energy related investments that private actors, and this space is very, very mature already. Adaptation, we are not seeing a lot of private actors, and what it really needs is a focus on enabling policy as well as first loss takers. And this, we believe, is a very important area where international and public agencies can really take action and show leadership. One important point, 3/4 of the climate finance that is actually going into a destination country goes back to source countries. And whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, we're happy to discuss that. Continuing on the same theme, adaptation is a space for this leadership, but it also is a space for showing large impacts. If we look at the nationally determined contributions that have been specified by countries in how they will achieve their Paris targets, if you consolidate all of them, we find that the overall mitigation gap, that is the amount of money that is required to cover the mitigation needs of developing countries, comes to about $850 billion or $1 trillion by 2030 per year for mitigation. On the other hand, if you were to look at the gap for adaptation, that is additional resources that are required to meet the adaptation needs of developing countries, that's approximately $140 to $300 billion. Now, by that rule, you would think, well, the gap is far more for mitigation. That's absolutely true. But guess what? If you wanted to be a leader in the climate space with each one of us, it's far more possible to make a big dent in that $140 to $300 billion space than it is for the $850 to $1 trillion space, right? So there's a large potential to make a dent in the gap that exists through adaptation finance. And the important thing is also to underscore that we have, in adaptation, we have solutions available, but these need to be scaled and now. And that's why adaptation finance is required now and not 20 years from now. Okay? And there's one other space that is really important where actors such as you and IFAD can really play a very important role, and that is in standard setting. I'll talk about this more, but really it's about ensuring that adaptation is well-defined, is measured well, and is credible so that we are moving away from the space that is traditionally called greenwashing, or what I have called with my co-authors in a different paper, impact washing or climate washing. And this is especially important because we want to ensure that this dollar that gets invested reaches people that need it most. So, going back to that question, again, if there is a gap that we are witnessing in adaptation, why is there one? And why isn't the private sector crowding in? And we've already covered some of the reasons that are there, right? So we need an enabling environment, policy, etc. But one of the other key reasons that the private sector is not coming in is because of measurement issues. And you would think, oh, well, this is geeky, let's leave it to the universities to do it. But actually, it's a really key reason as to why this space has not been attractive traditionally. One, adaptation is locally led, and it is context specific, which means that it is very often confounded with development. Second, there is no universal unit of measurement for adaptation, which means that it becomes really difficult to define success in adaptation, and which means it becomes even more important that we show integrity as we go forward in what counts as adaptation and what does not, right? And before I go into that, I do want to say that currently, as we look at the NDCs of the G7, we're finding that although there is a need for urgent action and there is a lot of commitments being made, and with due respect by the United States, by Canada, by Europe, etc., actually, if you look at the country-specific NDCs the Climate Action Tracker actually found that the NDC from the United States was critically insufficient, and those from Canada and Europe were insufficient to meet the 1.5-degree target and to really have the world be on the trajectory of a 1.5-degree world. Right? So it's really important that we think about what are the trajectories that we are fostering through our investments and how we can really plug the gap in that space. So the third part of this is really to get to what can organizations such as yourselves and ours do. And I want to talk very briefly about the IFAD example. IFAD, as Joanna said as well, is a UN agency as well as an international finance institution, which means that it has grants and it has loans. It has, between 2019 and 2021, invested almost $1 billion. So that's the lowermost bar on your screens, $946 million, almost $1 billion in climate finance. It has predominantly gone to adaptation, with less than 10% of it actually going into mitigation finance. Yeah? So we're really committed to ensuring there is adaptation finance going in. But the critical part of this is also recognizing that IFAD has what is the opportunity of blending finance. So it can give grant financing that is risk. It can support risky initiatives because that does not have to be returned, and it can provide loans as well. And so a large part of our program of work is really focused on providing loans to countries, but also ensuring that they're not in that space then indebted. Grant financing then helps them to get the technical advice and to create the enabling environment so that the loan financing can be supported. IFAD also has an a program called Adaptation for Smallholder Farmers, or ASAP, right? Till now, this has supported 6 million people additionally in coping with the effects of climate change, sequestered additionally 60 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalents, and it has brought additionally more than 1 million hectares of land under climate resilient practices. So it's really targeting the small scale producers through its ASAP 1 and 2 program till now. This is a program that IFAD started in 2012, and this is slowly coming to a close now. But we are starting a new program called ASAP Plus, which is essentially enhanced ASAP, which also brings in mitigation finance, but also focuses on nutrition and women. One of the things that we have been able to successfully do with the ASAP program, which really gives grant financing to small-scale producers and rural farmers, is invest in exciting pilot projects. But the interesting thing is, because IFAD has this program of loans that it can tag along with its grant financing, it has been able to take the successful pilot programs and really scale them up where these have been successful. So whether it's in Cambodia, whether it's in Mozambique, whether it's in Sudan, Niger, Chad, Mali, these are all areas where small pilot programs have been extremely successful and have been able to be scaled up to become very, very large programs and have really made a big impact. But it's essentially this idea of investing, testing, and scaling up, which is a paradigm that IFAD uses and will continue to use. The part about ASAP that personally I really like is the idea that it is grant financing, right? One of the key things that gets ignored about grant financing is, of course, when we go into negotiations is that, oh, grant financing essentially makes the recipient dependent. But guess what the other part of grant financing is? It is that you don't have to return those resources. What that means is that grant financing, especially in an area which has not seen a lot of innovation traditionally, is really, really required and necessary. Grant financing provided by programs such as the Adaptation for Smallholder Farmers program helps to really to highlight innovations and to guarantee innovations and to really take on the risk of failure, the dreaded F word, when it does so. And then when it is successful, like I said previously, to scale them up. We've supported innovative investments in technical, institutional, and financial areas. And this slide also gives you a sense of what it is that adaptation investments actually do, right? So adaptation investments help to develop and scale up the use of adapted seeds that are adapted to drought as well as high uncertainty in weather patterns, agroforestry systems, and set up climate-smart infrastructure and irrigation on the technical side. But they also help to set up climate information services. And guess what? A lot of countries just don't have them, or people don't use them. And so you really need to be innovative to figure out as to what can get people to use this information seriously. It also has helped to build community natural resource management systems that really get us the nature-based solutions, the resilience sort of nexus that I spoke about previously. What has really excited me about this space is where a lot of the innovation financing has gone into financial innovations, right? So e-vouchers, for example, or adaptation micro projects or micro insurance information systems. And most recently, blockchain technologies to ensure that we can track at every step as to where products are going in as part of a value chain and where they're coming out from, so that they can be nature sensitive or forest sensitive, right? So all of these are innovations that have been supported because of grant financing. One other space where really I think public and international organizations can really play a very, very important role is in ensuring transparency. It's a really big part of adaptation, and I'll talk about it very briefly, but just to say, I hope you've seen also the Quality of International Assistance Development Report. I beg your pardon, the Quality of International Development Assistance Report that was brought out by the Center for Global Development most recently. In the Quota 2021 report, we were all very excited. IFAD was ranked first on the quality of its development assistance, right? On ownership, on prioritization, on transparency, and on evaluation. But it's really the space of climate transparency that begs and inspires the question as to what we can do far more as a collaboration, as a partnership of agencies and organizations. One of the other things that we can do, depending on which part of this world really excites you, is measuring impact. Traditionally, one of the challenges of the adaptation space has been that it is really difficult to disaggregate or understand what is adaptation and what is development, but also understand what is the consequence or what is the result of the investments that we are making in adaptation. In this space, IFAD has pioneered the use of climate impact assessments. What are impact assessments? The word sounds boring, but really they're exciting because they are the equivalent of clinical trials in this space. That is, you're setting up comparison or control areas, and you're comparing them with the areas that IFAD investments come into, and these are then these are matched on the basis of the characteristics, so they are as similar as possible, and then the outcomes are compared. This then means that we are able to credibly say as to what has been a consequence of IFAD's investments in resilience and in adaptation compared to what would have occurred without this investment. Why this is really exciting for me is that very few other agencies can do this and are prepared to do this or have the wherewithal to do this, right? So it requires all of that. It requires the intention, it requires the ambition, but it also requires the systems. And we've got all three of those. Impact assessments basically keep us honest. Yeah. So whether it's in Mexico or Chad or Rwanda or Tajikistan or Bangladesh or Ethiopia or Malawi, we get to know where our investments are making a difference, how much, for whom, why, under what circumstances, and if not, why not? So for example, if you're looking at Chad, we've got a resilience-related investment there, which showed that yes, our investment led to a 17% increase in livestock assets. But guess what? There was no change in overall resilience, right? So it made us think about, well, what's happening that is really affecting the resilience of these populations? So the second part of this is that we can measure the change. So we can say, oh, it was a 30% increase in income, or it was a 17% overall increase in resilience, which again, like I said, very few other agencies can do. The second last part of what I want to say is talk very quickly about COP26 and really to underscore that this is a time for us to act, right? COP26 has 4 key things that basically will decide as to whether it's a success or not. Finance, clearly one of them. You know, are we going to get to the $100 billion or not? And the mythical $100 billion per year. But I'm really hoping personally that it's not mythical, you know, that we can all galvanize ourselves and really come to a space where we are able to see that kind of commitment through climate flows. But I think personally for me, it'll be really important to see a far greater commitment to adaptation and to resilience. Although there are a range of agencies, and I mean this with no malice to any one of them, that have committed themselves to really doing a 50-50 split in their overall investments to adaptation and to mitigation, what we're finding in real life is that this is, like I said earlier as well, that this mitigation financing far, far outstrips adaptation financing. If you look at the Green Climate Fund, for example, which is where I come from before IFAD, although that is there in its overall governing instrument, adaptation financing in dollar terms is 1/3 of its overall investment, right? So for me, I really think that that's one thing that we must see at Glasgow, which is a far greater commitment to adaptation in terms of climate flows and finance flows. Nature-based solutions and of course carbon markets and pricing will be key issues, and I'm happy to talk about them should we have the time. The last part of what I want to talk about is what can we do in the international sector, right? I think the key thing is think about, you know, what are the instruments that we have available to us as the organizations that we represent. So whether it is grant financing, whether it is non-grant instruments such as equity financing, guarantees, loans, working with sovereign agencies, working with non-sovereign agencies. Let's pick the instruments that we have available to us. And then let's try and see as to how we can target this big question of adaptation and resilience on the ground, because the need of the hour is today. Depending on what the instruments are that we have available for us, we can be innovators and first loss takers and really make it possible for the private sector to come in afterwards. So really be the frontiers people and the cowboys, right? On one side. Or if we have the power and the ability to really push for policy change and really come together and create a policy space, then let's do that. But there is also a need for bringing together what has been traditionally a very fractured space in terms of measurement. Even the MDBs have not been able to come together in terms of understanding as to how they can bring their overall standards and measurements together, especially in adaptation. And they differ mildly, but it is true that right now, climate financing measurement is still very nascent, primarily because there has been no agreement on how to measure this. And I think this is the space and the time for us to show that ability to take this forward. IFAD's comparative advantage, and of course I'm biased here, but I think it's really important at this point to recognize that IFAD has several areas where it has comparative advantages which can help us to get to that $100 billion target. First, it targets the sections of society which are really in need of adaptation and resilience related funding, right? Which is the poor, the vulnerable, the women, the indigenous people, and the farmers, right? All in rural spaces that are traditionally far less able to respond and cope and recover from climate-related uncertainty and disasters than any other part of the population. Second, we are able to work with policies as well as in partnerships, that is with all of you, but also with country governments and subnational partners to really do sovereign as well as non-sovereign work, both on the monetary side as well as in terms of policy and policy change. Third, we bring really critical technical expertise, whether that's in terms of understanding as to what can make people cope better, adapt better, recover better, or in measuring what counts as adaptation. We bring at design, at supervision, and at the result stage, a really a life cycle set of technical expertise. Last but not least, we focus on last mile interventions. One of the key things in the challenges, and a paper that I've written with co-authors just came out last week, finds that even with agencies such as the GCF, last mile gaps still remain. We don't know as to what can get a poorer farmer to really adopt agricultural insurance. This is a last mile problem. The large insurance companies can go in and say, we'll give you actuarially fair instruments, but adoption and uptake remains a problem, and that's the last mile problem that we all have to contend with. Those are areas that we have the ability and we are to work on, and we continue to work on and develop the science on. And last but not least, IFAD, because it is an IFI, so an international finance institution, as well as a UN agency, is able to bring all of these tools together. That is, it is able to target, it is able to look at policies, it is able to do technical expertise, but it is able to also blend grants with non-grant instruments. Thank you very much. And thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Joe. And to all of our participants, I know this has been a very chock full of detailed and complex information for you, but this is our first attempt to try to bring this group together. The reason that we've done that is that you folks are our friends, our allies, our collaborators and thought leaders, and we want to put this information up there for you to digest and for you to provide us guidance and your strategic thinking about how we can approach the next steps. And that's why our breakout sessions are so important to us today. We have a great opportunity with a new administration that's put climate change at the top of the agenda of their international as well as domestic policy. We have a year where there will be a UN Food Systems Summit. We have COP26 coming up, as Joe had mentioned. So we have a confluence of many streams coming together, and the opportunity for us to make this move forward is really tremendous. The objective of our breakout sessions is to get your thinking, and we have assigned 3 different questions to the 3 breakout groups. But all of the groups, what we would like you to do, if you see the first bullet point there, is that we want to make sure that we are thinking in terms of what the entry points are for our opportunity to shape policy with the Hill, with leaders in Congress, with the climate solutions caucuses that have been organized on a bipartisan basis in both the House and Senate, and with the administration in terms of the work that John Kerry's doing, the work that USAID is doing, as well as other agencies. So we want to think of this as how we want to put this into action. If we, at the very end of our breakout session, we want to just kind of get your thoughts regarding this ratio of 18:1 spending currently on the resources that go to mitigation as opposed to adaptation. And we would like to pose the idea that we set some target that makes sense to bring a greater balance between those two. So you're going to be assigned to a breakout session with an IFAD facilitator. There will also be some IFAD technical staff who can serve as resources. And group one is going to address the most effective ways to bring traditional mitigation focused donors into the adaptation space. The second group will address the question of the multilateral events such as COP26 coming up this year, how we can promote the US taking a leadership role in promoting adaptation strongly as part of their agenda. And then the third group will address what arguments are most compelling for why adaptation work is essential for small scale food producers. And we want to build those links to the questions of food security, food systems, humanitarian assistance, and so forth. So we'll have 20 to 25 minutes in your breakout group. I want to suggest that you very quickly just introduce yourselves and what organization you're from. We would like a reporter to either step forward and volunteer to be the report back person who will address the group when we come back together at about 10:30 or 10:35. And then we'll have a discussion at that time. And then we just want to dive into the substance of the questions that have been posed. We will have people taking notes, and we'll pull all of this together into a report that you'll get back after the session. So
So it looks like you're done with the breakout sessions, and I'm sure there was some very good conversations happening. I know in this breakout session I was a part of, there was a lot of good conversations and agreement and consistency on a number of topics. We're going to start going through some of the discussions that were brought up during the breakout sessions, and I'm going to start by going to the individual moderators, and then moderators, you can decide who's going to report out from your group. I'm gonna start with Joanna. Joanna, you as the moderator for your group. Do you want to give a report of what happened and what was discussed?
Yes, well, so I will say that we had a couple of glitches at the beginning as to which question we were handling. So just so folks know, we ended up, because we had Jo in the room, and I think that's, she's crucial to this particular question. We covered the sort of the COP26 question as the best abbreviation for that one. I'm going to hand it over to Caitlin, who's our reporter for our session.
Great, thank you. Okay, so again, questions that we addressed, how can we work to promote US focus on adaptation in these upcoming events, and how to better bring prominence to finance for climate adaptation? We actually found that this question was linked to the group of questions that were addressed in the third group. And so we talked about the need for really strong and clear top line messages to reach VIPs and bosses, and to just to get into the door, to get a foot in the door in these conversations. And then when it comes to the messaging, it's important to have a clear message, perhaps quantified, linked to a date or some amount of something, but also to make sure that it's not pitted against mitigation, because we understand the importance of all these things. It's not a competition between the two, but it's rather increasing the amount of financing for adaptation, just generally speaking. We also talked about capitalizing on interest in the White House, particularly by Vice President Harris on this issue, and just using the things that the White House is already saying to encourage them to do more, to put, to put money in action where, where their mouths are. And last thing is, when it comes to finance, we talked about the fact, using Chatham House rule, talked about the fact that when it comes to climate change finance that's used for adaptation, or agriculture finance that's used for climate change adaptation, it's often just relabeling money from one thing to something else. And actually that we should be considering setting a higher bar, which is calling for new financing and not just relabeling of financing that was already there. So feel free to chime in if I missed anything.
That was great, Caitlin. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We did cover a little bit of that last question too, which is we decided we needed a new way to phrase the ratio, if I'm summarizing that well, so that it's not, one versus the other, adaptation versus mitigation, but rather a need to increase that, something that is catchy, but also appeals to the broad swath of people in development and foreign policy, not just to folks who are ensconced in the climate world.
I think, Joe, you had a comment? Saw that your hand was raised.
Oh no, I was clapping for the summary that Caitlin did.
Great. All right. Anybody else from the group want to chime in? Okay, Rob, do a report from your group.
Well, our group actually started out essentially on the same question, since we did have a bit of confusion, but we didn't have Joe to advise us. We didn't entirely stay on it though. So Sarah Zubek of Duke has graciously agreed to report back, but I want to emphasize that all the members of the breakout session are able to chime in any final comments after Sarah's report. Sarah, thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, I didn't sign up to take notes, and so I haven't gotten the notes yet, but I'll do my best from what I remember, then maybe others can jump in. So ours was kind of honed in on what should organizations focused on small scale food producers and on food security aim for in the context of COP26, or how can we best promote an increased focus on adaptation at COP26? I think there weren't a lot of people with direct experience, but I think essentially the question we're pinging around is how do we get adaptation higher on the agenda for funding? And I think one of the topics that came up right away was how do you really just get awareness that the issues are real around climate change, especially within the US context, and that certainly a focus on livelihoods is a way to do that. We threw out some suggestions for people in the administration to reach out to, and then that's all I had in terms of my notes. So if anyone else who took notes wants to jump in, that would be great.
I would say some of our participants thought that in some respects we're almost a little too late for COP26. So there's some question about, how set in stone the agenda and opportunities might be. But there certainly is there was also mention of maybe needing to focus some on the adaptation work being done or needing to be done in the United States, which would kind of build a grassroots level of support for adaptation within the US. And I think there were some other really good points, and I asked my colleagues from the breakout group if they might chime in one or two.
Sure, may I add a point?
Yeah.
So we believe that adaptation is critical here, and scientists have been looking at adaptation since over 5 years, but people still don't think that it's real. And we also have a task to make people not dip into real pessimism. So we have to keep people from believing that if it comes to adaptation, we've already lost. So we have to avoid that thought process. There's a knock-off effects on investors and people. We need to have discussions around durability and inclusivity of economic recovery. And definitely we have to simplify the language So whatever high-level discussions we do in these committees, we have to simplify the language for the local subsistence farmer of low and middle income countries. And we have to bring in the language of cooperation. And then again, as Rob said, is the question around adaptation being asked too late?
Great, thank you. And thanks to our entire group. It was a great discussion.
Thanks, Rob. Nathan Ryder.
Thanks, Eric. I neglected to ask for a volunteer at the beginning of the session, so instead of taking everybody by surprise, Jean's decided to take on reporting back. We discussed which sort of stories to tell. What's the best angle for arguing for adaptation?
Thanks, Nathan. Yes, so first and foremost, with the tight and attention on budgets, is that every dollar needs to hit more than one impact, more than one outcome. So we really need to focus on the return on investment beyond climate, nutrition, resilience, and income. Basically, being able to tell a story that tells multiple stories. And whether that's in the agroforestry area or in nutrition programs or in relation to the root causes of conflict, migration, and national security. We were lucky to have a couple of people on different committees on the Hill. And so we had some insights in terms of framing a message that's valuable or be able to be heard by both sides of the aisle. And that's where the national security areas and the importance of adaptation related to these other issues, primarily migration and national security are powerful. We had a call for clarification on where some of these funding numbers related to the ratio, and I think that also came back with the, not competing with mitigation. They're not in competition, mitigation and adaptation. It's just making sure that where those numbers come from are clear, and fully coming back to the making farmers more profitable and resilient. There's also a comment about how, there's not a culture of failure, doesn't exist. And so if there's investigative or exploratory kind of initiatives, that kind of needs to be within the private sector area, not within the government spending area. And last but not least, the recognition that IFAD taking lead on this and putting the message out there is valued, that every dollar in preventative care saves multiple more dollars in ex post needs. Thanks, over.
Thank you. Nathan, do you have anybody else? Anyone else from your group speaking?
I know we sort of ran out of time, so if anybody else wants to jump in, feel free. Otherwise, I think Jean did a good job covering the bases there.
Am I missing any other groups? Just want to make sure I covered everyone. All right. Joanna, do you want to discuss next steps?
Sure. So I'll try to keep it brief, and I'm gonna go through a couple things that I picked up. And by no means am I do I have the corner on what all of our next steps should be. So I welcome ideas from anyone. I think as a next step, we would love, speaking for IFAD here, we would love to bring you all together again, perhaps in 6 to 8 weeks, something like that. Well, August being sort of a terrible time, but like August or September, to try to see where we're at on getting some of these messages out. And, at that point, where else we can put some focus. But I think, just to summarize a few things that came out of the groups, I think I definitely heard a focus on livelihoods as an argument, that making it real, coming up with top line messages that can really get to, high level officials is very important. I loved the addition of this idea that if we are supportive of domestic adaptation funding, domestic adaptation interventions, that could also manifest in more domestic support for international adaptation interventions. That was a very cool point. On the messaging itself, I think that we had in our group, I didn't hear a lot of talk about the ratio from the other groups, which is totally fine. We did it really quick in our group too. But this idea of rethinking and reframing that ratio so that both it's something understandable outside of climate circles, who may not necessarily understand the big disaggregation between mitigation and adaptation. And also just coming at it in a way that inside those circles that it is clear that we're talking about adaptation, but not at the expense of mitigation. So coming up with a new ratio, I personally pledge to give that some thought over the next week. And if anybody's uncomfortable with the idea of like some emails going out in your direction, let me know, but otherwise I may actually bounce them off the group if that's okay. And I think, you know, I heard loud and clear that capitalize on this, the focus of on Central America by the administration. I think that was a really very helpful comment, and something that we have thought about internally at IFAD, but that I think folks on the inside were not in Chatham House rules here. We're not entirely convinced that that was necessarily a channel that would be as successful, but it gives us more ammunition to push that because these are folks who are not necessarily working with US circles. So they didn't necessarily understand the compellingness of that. I love the embracing the culture of failure. I think that bringing in the private sector element of that is really important. So thinking through between now and when we next meet, how we can best encourage that, how we can best be a part of that and enable that, I think will be very good. The final thought that I wanted to throw in there, and then I'm going to invite anybody to sort of come in on top of that, is Asma. I know you have your video off, so pardon me for putting you on the spot, but Asma has done some really good work both in the past and currently going towards the future of trying to get people to sort of come together around statements, around documents of what's important to us on this front. Now, I don't want to misstate what Asma is working on, but like one of the things that she has been working on is, you know, sort of getting people together around SDG 2, civil society involvement, making sure that we're really pushing for the right things on SDG 2. Similarly, I wonder if there's a way that we can kind of put together something that has some signatories. I don't have a fulsome idea on this front, but something where we can put together some commonly shared ideas on the importance of adaptation for smallholders and push that forward. Now, I'm going to go ahead and say that I'm sure that there are academic and policy pieces around this already, but this would be more like a bit of an advocacy piece to sort of say, here's where we need to see more donor focus. And it doesn't have to be donors. It can also be, you know, adding some ground up sort of focus as well. If that is something that people think holds promise, that is something that we could probably, we wouldn't be able to have it be an IFAD generated document officially, but certainly it's something that we could work on. So I'd be interested in hearing any feedback on that. So that's what I have on next steps. It's a little roughshod. I invite anybody to either polish that and or mention anything I've missed, other things that you think would be helpful. And again, feel free to put us on the spot. That's why we're here.
Yeah, this is Eric. Just to follow up, Joanne, I think from the Alliance perspective, we would love to work with you all on any way to organize messaging, particularly that helps around advocacy. Another thing I would mention is efforts to approach the Hill, and probably once this messaging and other ideas become a little bit more formal, that is something we definitely want to put forward to the Hill as a message point that the community or a group of partners and group of stakeholders all support. So that to be the one thing I would want to add is the Hill component.
If I could jump in with a point as well, I would say I don't want this to be too much of a bait and switch situation. We invited you for a 1.5 hour session, but we'd like to look at you as our brain trust, and that we keep this process of communicating dynamic and ongoing and not necessarily reliant on meetings or sessions, but to be very fluid and kind of keep the dialogue going as we move forward so that we can be more effective.
I know there are a couple people with their hands raised, Rob.
I see. Asma?
Yeah, thanks, Joanna, for the shout out. I think one of the things I'm exploring right now is sort of a call to action or a new consensus around smallholder farmers. And so including the whole set of issues around adaptation would clearly be part of that. But as you were talking, I was thinking about also in July, the SOFI report will come out with new numbers on hunger and food insecurity and malnutrition. I'm wondering, especially in the US space, how do we use that to really put a human face on the climate issues and building towards the Food System Summit and COP as well. I don't know if that came up in the conversations in the small group you were in, but yeah, thanks.
Great. And James, I see your hand up.
Yeah, just two brief thoughts. So if you want to influence COP, I mean, you have to get to the UK. They're the presidency, and the UK obviously listens a lot to the US, but make sure that you're always thinking about that end goal because they're the ones who are setting the agenda. And so Alok Sharma as the president of the COP is key. So that's just one piece. And then on the adaptation mitigation finance target, the Secretary General is already calling for G7 countries to meet a 50-50% split in their funding between adaptation and mitigation. So I don't know if you're looking then below that for something that's specific to the agriculture sector, but that's how he's interpreting the Paris Agreement to balance the two, I suppose. You have MDBs and DFIs that are already making commitments to reach 50-50 spending on mitigation and adaptation. And I think it's easier given that the 100 billion a year is going to be a floor from which future commitments, I think after 2025, increase. So an increase at a faster pace for adaptation shouldn't reduce the amount of mitigation funding, but that will only come in after 2025, I think.
Thank you. Joe?
Yeah, really good points. Thanks, James. Yeah, the Alok Sharma point is well taken. So the president of IFAD, one of the colleagues, and I met him actually a few weeks ago when he was in Rome. Yeah, we made the point about adaptation, and he was absolutely on board. And which is why, you know, I think the idea, and in his words, he sort of recognized that it was a really important ask as well as ambition for COP, both the 100 billion overall climate finance, but also thinking about balancing. So I'm not trying to say that the two fields are competing, but this 1-to-1 ratio that James you referred to is pretty much, you know, state of the art in terms of what the ambition is with respect to climate for a lot of the agencies, right? The Green Climate Fund will say 50-50, so half and half will go to adaptation mitigation. In a lot of agencies, that is the ambition. The challenge is really having a set of bankable investments on the ground in developing countries that the private sector can really come into and really fly with, right? So I was speaking with the CDC, and they are really trying to get to a portfolio of investable projects, bankable projects that they can invest in and take forward. But that essentially is if you think about, the work that DARPA does in the United States, that's essentially asking for that kind of work to be done in the adaptation space, which is come in first, take the risk, you know, fund things like Siri and Google and the algorithms, and then let the private sector come in and fly with the things that are going to fly. But you've got to have the DARPAs of this world really going forward with innovation. And we haven't seen that in adaptation. And we need to see it. And that's the case that I'm really keen to see that if we want private sector to come into this space, we've got to have, you know, the investments ready. But we are still a little bit far away from there. And that's why there is a really important space for international and public agencies to take on. Thanks.
That is a great point. And we have reached the 11 o'clock hour. Do Joanna or Eric want to make any final closing comments?
John, I'll let you close us out.
Just to say thank you to everybody. As you can see from the chat, I love how lively this has become. You know, if you get in touch with us, if you want to opt out of potential follow-up emails on this, but otherwise, and if you want to opt out of the brain trust, but otherwise we would love to take advantage of having pulled this group together. We thank Alliance so much for doing so. It's been super helpful to us. And I'm particularly loving the sort of, you know, deeper ag stuff that we're getting in the chat as well. So let's keep the chat open for a couple more minutes since folks are adding stuff now. But I turn it over to Eric with our great thanks for again to you and your team for pulling this together.
Thank you, and I want to thank you guys for this partnership. You've been great partners over the years, and we look forward to continuing this partnership going into this year. Some great ideas about next steps and how we can seize on these opportunities that we're starting to see, not only here in the United States, but globally. The unfortunate circumstances of the pandemic, as well as other conflicts that we're seeing around the world, has opened our eyes to a lot of things. And there's definitely an obvious connection between climate and hunger and malnutrition. And I think from our perspective, this has to be one of the things that we consider as root causes to hunger, and this has to be something that we have to look at in building the policies to help combat it and to help address areas where we can. So we look forward to working with this group, with you all on this issue. And want to thank you all again for taking the last hour and a half of your time and spending it with us.